We are finishing up Standard 8 and actually all of our standards for the year. This is the very last video of the entire year, so congrats on making it this far. We are looking at today foreign policy from 1990 to present. We're going to look at America's role in the changing world. We're going to talk about the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the expansion of the European Union, the continuing rise or crisis in the Middle East, and the rise of global terrorism. So we start with the end of the Cold War. Basically, conservatives and liberals look at the end of the Cold War from different perspectives. Conservatives credit United States policy with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, saying that Reagan basically helped push the Soviet Union to collapse, while liberals credit forces within the Soviet Union for bringing about change. And that was done when Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union, and he advocated glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, which means economic restructuring. The Soviet bloc nations were also seeking change, including independence movement within Poland and the Baltic states. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had placed a large strain on the Soviet economy, and it put it near collapse. And then really the symbol that ended the Cold War was the destruction of the Berlin Wall, which is pictured here. And that really showed that the Cold War was coming to an end because the Soviet Union couldn't do much to stop it. Soviet hardliners attempted to overthrow Gorbachev, and that resulting confusion led to the breakup of the Soviet Union into separate states. So we have to look at what the United States' role is. Certainly, the buildup of arms throughout the Cold War, and especially during the Reagan administration, placed a lot of strain on the Soviet economy. However, most historians will argue that the Soviet Union fell because of internal problems rather than as a direct result of the American policy of containment. At the end of World War II, the United States had assisted other European nations in their recovery from the war in order to serve as a strong bulwark against the spread of communism. While the United States has continued to protect Europe through the North American Treaty Organization and deployed weapons throughout Europe to confront the Soviet threat, the Europeans have also established a European common market in order to improve trade within the region. Eventually, the European common market established a common currency called the euro and evolved into the European Union. The United States has really provided a model of how a federal system could go and how the European common market was created. And what that means is like the power between the federal government and the state governments, like we talked about in the beginning of this class. So after the Cold War, as a result of the end of the Cold War, the United States has become the world's only superpower. Therefore, the United States has had a greater responsibility around the world to maintain peace in the face of regional conflicts, but in that process has also aroused resentment, especially in the Middle East. And liberals and conservatives have different perspectives on the proper role of the United States in the world. How involved should the U.S. be around the world? We've talked about that quite a few times in this class. One thing that's going to cause problems for the United States is the establishment of the State of Israel. Not to complain about it, but it does lead to problems. Not that it's a wrong thing, but it does. As a homeland, it's a homeland for Jewish people in the wake of the Holocaust. That's why it was created. But the fact that U.S. has been helping Israel has kind of outraged some of the Arab people that are around Israel. And if you look at the stages of Israel's development, you see that actually Israel used to be the state of Palestine, which belonged to England, and then it was eventually split into Israel and Palestine. Really, Israel controls much of Palestine now, so that's a big issue on whether Palestine should have its own country. In an effort to maintain friendly states on the border of the Soviet Union, the CIA aided in the overthrow of nationalist government in Iran and supported the repressive regime of the Shah until he was overthrown by Muslim fundamentalists. That's going to cause anger in Iran, and that's probably one reason why Iran's one of our biggest enemies to this day. The United States also supported Israel against its Arab neighbors, and that's going to cause problems, especially when you think about the fact that those Arab neighbors have oil that the United States needs. Terrorist groups attempted to call attention to the plight of Palestinians, the fact that they were losing their land, like I showed you in that picture earlier. And they tried to extort concessions from the Israelis by hijacking airplanes, cruise ships, and by sending suicide bombers to murder civilians and spread terror. The United States policy has always been that it would not negotiate with terrorists. So we need to look at some different presidents and the impact they had on the Middle East. So we start with Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon, he did the shuttle diplomacy to try to stop the oil embargo, which we talked about in an earlier unit. Jimmy Carter had the Camp David Accords, where he brought peace to the Middle East through Egypt and Israel signed a peace agreement. And then at the end of Carter's presidency, Iranians invaded the American embassy and held 52 American hostages, which has been tested before and could possibly be on the EOC. Once Reagan became president, the hostages were released, but another incident that happened in the Middle East had to do with Lebanon. Terrorists bombed the United States Army barracks, and so they negotiated with the regime in Iran to gain the release of American hostages held in Lebanon. The United States attempted to exercise leadership in the Middle East because of the American dependence on foreign oil. And one way that happened was through the first Gulf War. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and then the U.S. along with a bunch of other countries went in and basically got Iraq out of Kuwait. They didn't go far, and that's going to be one of the criticisms later, especially of conservatives, the saying that George W. Bush's father, didn't go far enough to get rid of Saddam Hussein when it happened. Here are some pictures from the first Persian Gulf War. Very successful war, very quick. Not a lot of Americans were lost. This is a kind of a break here to remind you that you have to be able to locate Israel, Afghanistan, Iraq on a map. That will definitely be tested. That will definitely be on the test. You'll have to locate each of those places. And so here's a map that has all three of them. After the first Gulf War, there's going to be some problems. One is that the U.S. is going to leave troops in Saudi Arabia. And so the religious fanatics in the area are going to get upset about that. And actually a lot of terrorists that are part of Al-Qaeda come from Saudi Arabia. Those terrorists are going to join with other fanatic religious fundamentalist groups like the Taliban in Afghanistan that had driven the Soviets out to form terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda. And that's going to lead to September 11th. After the bombing of the World Trade Center on 9/11 by Al-Qaeda, the United States sent military forces to overthrow the Taliban in Afghanistan because they had harbored Al-Qaeda. And so that starts the whole Afghanistani war, which we're still in right now. Not long after, the United States government, citing the presence of weapons of mass destruction, invaded Iraq, and that was George W. Bush. That was part of that, plus Afghanistan as well was George W. Bush. The only problem with that is that they never found those weapons of mass destruction. The Iraqi war is a success initially, defeat the Iraqi army pretty quickly. The problem has been that it ends up being an unpopular war like Vietnam, which we'll talk about in class and compare the two in class. So today, the United States continues to have troops in Afghanistan and is supporting the democratic institutions in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Had a little bit of setback in Iraq just recently with the loss of the city of Fallujah. During the Arab Spring of 2011, the United States provided diplomatic support to those protesting for more democratic institution and gave air support to Libyan pro-democracy forces. There are issues today in both Syria and Egypt, kind of dealing with the same thing. President Obama has pledged that U.S. forces will not get involved. That's probably because of some of the lessons they learned from Iraq. They don't want to be involved in another unpopular war. The United States continues to try to mediate the issue of a Palestinian state, but has had very little success. That was one of Obama's big agenda items, that he wanted to help create a Palestinian state. Remember, that's the area that was taken from Israel, but he has had very, very little success, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen before he leaves office. The Middle East continues to be a major area of concern for American foreign policy. It's very important for us to be able to keep that area under control, because that's where a lot of our foreign oil comes from. And if something were to happen to cause instability in that area, we'd be in a lot of trouble economically without that foreign oil. So that's where we're at today. Please turn in your notes guide and take the video quiz. Thank you.